in this bubble chamber photograph, the curlicue in the very center is an electron. And notice that the electron spins itself into a spiral. The electron does not spin itself in a circle, but into a spiral, which means that it has an energy which does not make some geometrically static form like a circle, but it has an energy which glances off a symmetrical, static, geometrical position and describes energetically then an ever-focusing spiral. This is a photograph of an event in a bubble chamber. It's a nuclear physics event, and it shows very clearly some principles of nature that we have been talking about, and we need to focus ourselves today. Nature does not make circles. The mind needs to be tutored a long time to make circles. And when the mind, having been tutored a long time, makes circles, the mind then looks at nature and sees circles everywhere. This is unnatural. And almost every educational institution in the world today bases itself upon a development of human nature and society and goals and purposes, which are all projections of an over-tutored mind cutting out shapes from nature and holding them up as somehow being natural paradigms, and having the temerity to call this logical. It is in no way logical, is a disservice educational, is completely unnatural, and one cannot go very far in this universe with such an outlook. This education is extremely natural, extremely practical, very logical, and goes everywhere that we would wish to go at any time. Now that spiral of the electron moves particularly in a counterclockwise fashion and makes increasingly smaller loops. And it shows that in nature, integration in movement, focusing, is one of the basic principles. And yet, in the photograph, one can notice that there are many arcs that do not integrate, that go off in an opposite direction. And in fact, one of the most conspicuous lines going off, the arc down in the lower part, is paired with that spiral and is actually a negative electron particle going off. Now this negative electron particle is a curiosity, because the electron in and of itself has a negative quality, and so the positive electron is called a positron, and the positron in and of itself is such a curious particle, and it shows such an oddity about nature that it almost stymies the theoretical mind, and in fact great theorists like Bohr, who was one of the greatest of all, initially denied that the positron could be. And a very lowly, at the time, physicist named Carl Anderson, a very prosaic name, in 1932, stuck his neck way out and said that the interpretation of a photograph, very much like the one that I showed you, showed that there was such a thing as positron. And in this book, published by Cambridge University Press, The Concept of the Positron, there is a photograph opposite page 137 of that famous event. And what happens here is the obverse of the previous shot. In this photograph, the two trails come together. The positron emerges from underneath the photograph and merges with the electron and disappear from sight. You can see, because they leave no trail then, the positron and the electron together, making a neutral particle which does not leave a trail. That is to say, it doesn't ionize the liquid in the bubble chamber. It was impossible, without a philosophic adjustment on the part of theoretical particle physics, to accept the positron. The linchpin in the logical recalibration was to understand the principle of equivalence. And the recalibration was from a logical insistence upon identity, recalibrating identity so that one could accept principle of equivalence. And this was extremely difficult to redo. And from the late 1920s to the early 1930s, from 1926 roughly to about 1932, in that 6-year span, the mind of the world had to make this recalibration. And in doing so, awakened a sense of nature that had been dormant in the West for many hundreds of years, probably several thousand years, and had been discredited as some kind of Asian-style daydreaming. And from the mid-1930s on, increasingly, particle physicists have had an affinity not only with Chinese Taoist thought, that Asian daydreaming, but with the mystical Western origins of thought, generally grouped together under the aegis of the label Pythagoreanism. So that Pythagoras in the ancient West and the I Ching and Lao Tzu in the classical East were brought back into current natural philosophy from the 1930s on. And in the 1960s, some 30 years later, it was all of a sudden popularized by Fritjof Capra in his book, The Tao of Physics, which went through 3 editions and sold millions of copies worldwide. And it became somewhat of a fad then to say that modern Western science and Asian mystical philosophy shared a view of nature. It's somewhat simplistic to say this, but it has a working basis which we need to consider deeply at this stage. What stage are we at? We're at the very first part of our education. It is so fundamental, one can hardly believe empty chairs. It's fundamental because the recalibration has not penetrated through to the general public at all. By the general public, I mean the roughly 5.5 billion human beings who are alive on this planet now, do not realize, do not understand that they are living on the basis of projected unnatural shapes, of discredited logical operators and procedures, and are literally, they are the ones who are daydreaming. And that the very fundamental practical basis upon which technology and life and art and human adventure are based are by leaps and bounds, by progress of orders leaving them behind. And consistently, what turns out sociologically is a case of the mass of the population regressing into a medieval stasis, the governing structural form becoming a feudal regression, and the evanescent cream of humanity evaporating into the outer space ether, which will leave behind a congealed mediocrity which does nothing except get in its own way. Now, this scenario, by 1996, is in place so well that it will take a major effort to undo this. The gluing of mediocrity into a congealed immobility is well advanced, and the evanescence of insightful men and women who will evaporate away from this stasis is already very far advanced. And the setting up of international corporations on an old feudal basis, feudal kingdoms, is already well established, and the jockeying is going on daily. That's what mergers are all about. That's what the latest FCC bill is all about. So this education, rather than being a little cream puff goodie for the cognoscenti, will turn out to be the crowbar that's absolutely necessary, finally, to pry things loose. Why this education? Are there not alternatives? The alternatives that have been developed under the institutional aegis of the past are already co-opted into procedures and shapes, sequences, and orders that are not at all critically available for recalibration as long as you have worked within existing institutional bases. And included in that institutional basis is the state of the mind, the spectrum of the personality, the capability of experience, and a whole range of other considerations. Let's come back to our education now. We're at Nature 6. Each of the arcs of our education, there are 4 in a given year, so each of the arcs is a quarter of a circle. And each of those quarters of circle have 12 sequential units, and we're at Nature 6, so we're at the middle of the first. Whenever one gets to the middle of an arc, one has an apex by which there is a structural line to the center. At the beginning, at the middle, and at the end, one has structural accesses to the center. We will see in about 4 months' time that the whole nature of a myth is that there be a middle that is consistent with a beginning and an end. And that the middle is in between an initiation point, a beginning, and an end point. That this middle occupy the in-between of these 2 points is extremely important because it is the archetypal basis upon which all human feeling makes sense. It's the archetypal basis upon which the structure of experience is able to be dealt with. By dealt with, I mean experience must be in some way had to know what you are experiencing, to experience what you are experiencing, to be able to associatively link it together with other experiences, and for those experiences to be recallable, to be memorable, for those experiences to be shareable, communicative, and the commutative quality of experience has its own mathematics. All of these are subsumed under what we will look at as myth. And all of them have this procedure that we have to be able to, in the middle of an experiential movement, be able to access a center. Now, this language is at the same time very familiar and yet elusive. It's instructive and it's also puzzling at the very same time. Somehow the words and the concepts, the ideas, the images seem familiar, and yet the way that I'm using them now, it has an unfamiliar tone to it. This is natural. This is the way in which nature actually in itself operates. I want to come back to the positron. I want to come back to the way in which recalibration is important, but I want to come to it from a different angle. So let's go to one of our pairs of texts, the particle explosion paired with galaxies. And these 2 texts together are the pair of books that we're working with in the second tier of the nature lecture. The first pair were the I Ching and the portable Thoreau. The second pair, galaxies and the particle explosion. The third pair will be Jane Goodall's great little book called Through a Window and James Watson's The Double Helix. So we will have 3 pairs of books making a set of 6. Now, why are 3 pairs making a set of 6 so primordial? In terms of Asian mysticism, the Chinese Tao was originally a pair, not yin-yang, but Tao-Te. And when Tao-Te are brought together, when a broken line symbolizing the mysteriousness of Tao and an unbroken line symbolizing the directness of Te, when they are brought together, their effective form is in a triad, the trigrams. And pairing the trigrams gives us the hexagrams of the I Ching. Why should this be so? Why should there be pairs? And why should there be then triads? And why should triads be paired into a set of 6? Is this some artifact of Asian thought? When we look at a table of particles in the back of the particle explosion, we notice that there are 3 basic families of particles that control a large realm of this universe. Each of these families of particles form sets of 6. This book is 1987, so the gauge bosons do not have the graviton in it, and the graviton would make a set of 6 down here. Sets of 6, that is to say hexagrams, are always pairs of triads, and pairs of triads are always engendered by the dynamic of pairs which are held not in an identical symmetry, but are held in an approximate equivalence, leaving room for some uniting third aspect. To put it simply, in a realistic, inclusive view, there is always something more than the symmetry of polarity which existence displays. In existence, polarity is very often the operative structure. Electricity has a positive and a negative pole, and yet just having the positive and negative pole itself does not make electricity. There must be a flow between the poles. That flow is a synthesizing third. The current, so well described by Ampere or by Senor Volta, the flow between the poles unites the polarity together in an electric current. There's always a synthesizing third. So it's one of the great principles, not only of the classical West, the Pythagorean West, the Platonic West, the Plotinian West, but also of deep Asian wisdom, the Chinese, and also in India. And it also characterizes wisdom in the late 20th century. Polarities can best be described as pairs in symmetry, a pair in symmetry. Now, one has to be cautious because the projective, preemptive, learned response is to think that somehow identity is involved in this process. And this is a preemptive, projective error which unnaturally is introduced by the habit of a miseducation. And a lot of what we're talking about today is to try to recognize that we're weaning ourselves away from introducing subconsciously or projectively or assumptively the overwhelming idea of identity in all of the processes which have to do with nature as a fundamental basis upon which all of our education is going to be based. All of our maturation is going to be based. All of our development will be founded upon nature. And if we preemptively, projectively, authoritarianly keep introducing the necessity, the absolute tyranny of identity into every aspect of this, we will eventually just go round in circles. And we will find satisfaction in definitions that go around in circles. And we will come to sing that wonderful song from that tongue-in-cheek movie, Earth Girls Are Easy. What's wrong with you? Why can't you be me? Followed by the hit song, I'm a Blonde. I'm being both very harsh and also circumambulatory today, as you can see, because I'm trying to stiff arm subconscious and unconscious habitual techniques. I'm stiff arming them at the same time as appealing to and luring out the winged qualities of our response to language. So I'm doing two things at the same time. I'm inviting and I'm forbidding at the very same time. Now, notice that the two hands, the forbidding and the inviting, happen together. And if you were looking at this in terms of identity, you would say that this is a contradiction. Whereas if you're looking at this in terms of equivalence, you need to factor both those together and to see that there's a moderating operative background that allows for both the forbidding and the inviting to take place at the same time. What process both forbids and invites? The process of selection. And we will find in ritual that selection is one of the most basic of all human actions. Deeper than that, all life forms must make selections in order to survive. And that very often survival is not on the basis of the fittest, but the fittest is a subcategory of the ability to select wisely. Or perhaps that's putting it too strong. The ability to select so that that life form can continue, just even on that simple level. And we will see that very often, selection in the ritual sense depends upon a cooperation between two selectors or more, and that the principle that evolves out of this is reciprocity. You allow me to select some of what I really need, and I will allow you to select some of what you really need. And on the basis of doing this together, we both are able to select enough to continue our lives, but with reciprocity, allowing for each other to continue. And we will see that the fundamental ritual basis of all higher forms of life involve selection and reciprocity. The flowers and the bees have a selective reciprocity, and human groups that are stable have a selective reciprocity. This can be traced back to nature. But if there is an insistence upon identity ruling, the selective reciprocity process gets shorted out. And only circles, why can't you be me, will be operative. One of the deepest qualities of nature that we have seen expressed so beautifully in the I Ching, experienced so deeply by Thoreau when he was just there surveying the snowstorm in the forest, allowing himself to be absorbed by the forest in the snowstorm so that the survey was done in peace. All of one kind. He joined the trees. He joined the trees in the snowstorm. In the I Ching, it's called Tao. It has a particular quality, and the particular quality is that it has no quality whatsoever. It has no taste. It has no designatable anything. And we would say, trying to find a language which works, we would say then that that Tao is zero-based. And rather than a zero, which does not exist, it's a zero that occurs before existence happens. Now, a second major insight, which we introduced for the first time here, the real, being zero-based, is never paired, it's always unique. There's no symmetry in Tao. There's no symmetry in the real. It is always asymmetrical, always unique. Whereas existence is always tending to be symmetrical and approaches identity but does not achieve it. That the process of equivalence and similarity, the idea of similarity, the idea of equivalence, are much more apt in talking about existence in its polarity rather than the insistence upon identity. This holds all the way down to atomic particles. For instance, one of the great families of particles that are fundamental, that are building blocks to make the proton, to make the neutron, and so forth, are quarks. Quarks never exist alone. They always tend to be paired with their anti-particle, so that whenever one has a quark, there's an anti-quark that's paired with it. Now, this is not a dualism, but this is a symmetry, and the correct way to talk about it is with symmetry. For instance, there are 3 quarks that have a particular quality to them. One of them is called up. Another one is called down. And then there's one that's simply called strange. There are 3 other quarks that have a remarkably similar, but not identical. They have an equivalent, but not identical, process and quality. One is called bottom, the other is called top, and the third is called charm. Up, top, down, bottom, strange, charm. And these 6 quarks not only tend to occur paired in a symmetry, but when that symmetry is not immediately operative, the quarks tend to group in triads. And when they group in triads, they form very stable matter. How stable? The most stable matter in the universe is the proton. The life expectancy of a proton once it's created is 10 to the 32nd years. That's 10 with 32 zeros. The neutron, as long as it's in a nucleus paired with a proton, will have a similar life pattern, a similar life extension. But if a neutron is taken out of a nucleus, it lasts about 15 minutes. What happens to it? It decays. It falls apart into its constituent particles, which are unstable, and they fall apart into yet more. And they fall apart into the quarks, which then regroup because they don't like to be alone. They always like to be paired with their anti-quark. For each of the 6 quarks has an anti-quark. So with the up and the top, there's an anti-up and an anti-top. With the down and the bottom, there's an anti-down and an anti-bottom. And with the strange and the charm, there's an anti-strange and an anti-charm. Notice that pairedness in no way necessitates a dualism or an identity. It is a philosophic chimera to insist upon a dualistic philosophy as a doctrine and an identity as a logical procedure. It's grade school logic to insist upon identity. It's junior high sophistication to recognize that probability and equivalence and similarity are much more operative, and you can do a lot of permutations with that. The only thing you can do with insisting upon identity is to stamp your feet when someone is not you. And you can stamp your feet for 10 to the 32nd years, they will not be you. And so the insistence upon these tyrannical doctrines and procedures does a disservice to all human life and to all animal life, and incidentally to all plant life, and come to think of it, to the universe at large. So our education involves, at the middle of the very first spectrum, a recalibration. We have to wean ourselves away from a pernicious bad habit. And that pernicious bad habit is embedded in an insidious bad doctrine. And the origins of the ego, embedded in a totalitarian political system, are exactly here. You don't have to go any further. So the recalibration back to nature, which is what Thoreau was all about. Thoreau weaned himself away from the then dominant European tradition of violence and revolution and authoritarianism, weaned himself back to a place where experience could be very close to zero-based Tao. There are times when Thoreau, when he was about 20 years old, a genius, he dropped out of Harvard, but that doesn't mean anything in the 1840s. Harvard at that time had just a few professors, and there were only 5 subjects that were taught, including theology and law and a few other things. When Thoreau dropped out, he self-educated himself and was fortunate enough to have someone like Emerson around to help him. And he got a gift of a set of books from England. A man named Thomas Cholmondeley sent him a set of Asian classics. And that set of Asian classics came to Concord in the United States, and it came to the household where Emerson and Thoreau were living together. Emerson married with his family and Thoreau living in the house. And one can see the complete response on the part of Emerson and Thoreau, but in a particularly distinct, different way. Emerson immediately understood Asian wisdom to be affine to the transcendentalism that had been developed by the mind of Goethe on the basis of Fichte's development from Kant, and European, German, Romantic transcendentalism appealed so deeply to Emerson that he understood Asian wisdom in a kind of a correspondent way. But Thoreau, who didn't have that particular predilection and background, simply absorbed that Asian wisdom direct. And instead of having a correspondence, Thoreau developed a similarity. And so one finds in Emerson's transcendentalism a correspondence to Asian wisdom. But in Thoreau, one finds an Asian sage living in Concord. So much so that a century later, when the deeper second and third generation Gandhians were studying the origins of some of Gandhi's insights into human nature, they discovered that one of the most primordial of all was Thoreau. That Gandhi, the karma yogi, who learned to translate the Bhagavad Gita directly into life. A karma yogi does not theorize, he does. He's an experimenter. And so Gandhi entitled his autobiography, My Experiments with Truth. And he says right away at the beginning, I am a scientist of the real. I deal with the realm that is true. And in this realm, we must wean ourselves away from bad habits that we have learned to learn how to deal with the real in its way so that we can have a human society and human personalities that are operative within a realistic universe and not at all the fanciful projections. He then said, most education in his day was dominated by British Empire idealism, which mulched everyone together in the same kind of format. It prepared people to be bureaucratic clerks within the empire, which is very similar to the Chinese civil service exam set up in the Han Dynasty. Gandhi learned from Thoreau, and Thoreau learned from the Bhagavad Gita, but Thoreau absorbed the Bhagavad Gita in such a way that he was the Bhagavad Gita. When Gandhi read Thoreau, he did not see someone who had correspondingly developed an analog to the Bhagavad Gita, but he saw, by absorbing Thoreau, that Thoreau had absorbed the Bhagavad Gita. And Gandhi, who had already absorbed the Bhagavad Gita, saw it come together into a unique oneness. Gandhi called that Satya, which means truth. And that word Satya in Indian philosophy is exactly what aletheia means in Greek philosophy. Aletheia, meaning truth in Greek philosophy, is exactly what in Indian philosophy is called Satya. Truth is when the parentness of existence comes into a single uniqueness which can no longer be split apart any further and cannot be integrated any further. When one comes to that point, it's then called real, because all of the symmetries come together, all of the pairs come into oneness, all of the correspondences become aligned. In both ancient Indian thought, ancient Chinese thought, ancient Greek thought, logic was always developed upon a shared basis, that wherever you have polarity, you have analogy. Analogy and polarity always march together. They're the left and right foot of the same process. Analogy and polarity. When analogies and polarities come together and are resolved, that then is a locus upon a base which allows for no further integration. Nature has this kind of capacity all the time. We do also. We call this a zero base, but it doesn't mean non-existent. It means that this zero base functions as the origin which continues as the context for all of the paired polarities of existence. And that at any point of paired polarized existence, one can vanish the pair into the background. One can integrate the polarity into the unique. These instances of the unique occurring within life are points of insight. Let's take a break. Before the break, we were talking about how the early 1930s and the late 1920s was such a formative period. From 1926 to 1932, and those 6 years. One of the great achievements of those 6 years was the discovery of an equivalence between two completely different theoretical understandings of physics. On the one hand was an understanding of the way in which energies and matter moved within a matrix, and this was the theory that was credited to Werner Heisenberg, Heisenberg's matrix theory. On the other hand, and I mean completely on the other hand, was a very different understanding of the same universe with the same rigorous mathematical background and insight, only this was an understanding based upon waves that belonged to the mind of a man named Schrödinger, Erwin Schrödinger. The surprise that Schrödinger's wave mechanics were equivalent to Heisenberg's matrix mechanics was one of the great startling realizations of 1932. It probably didn't seem like it at the time, but it was as important as FDR becoming president of the United States. And in terms of the next several thousand years, it might be even more important. Part of the importance was that there was no way in which Schrödinger's wave theory and Heisenberg's matrix theory of particles, no way that the waves and the particles were identical. No way. But that they were equivalent and admitted of reciprocity on a deep mathematical and on a very practical universal scale was an exclamation mark for world civilization. It was the realization again that one can talk about this universe in terms of similar, symmetrical pairedness, that light is carried by a particle called a photon and at the same time is a wave. That there is such a thing as an electromagnetic spectrum, which was a spectrum of energy states of waves, and at specific points on that wave spectrum were particles that actually existed in time-space. This was not possible as long as someone was insisting on identity as the criterion of proof. So that when one comes to this beautiful volume, the concept of the positron, one finds the beautiful summation here in the chapter on equivalence. Talking about the way in which equivalence of Schrödinger's wave mechanics and Heisenberg's matrix mechanics, that their equivalence was mathematically demonstrated by a man named Max Born, but it was no proof in the strict sense mathematically, as long as one clung to the idea of identity. The conclusion, it is no proof in the strict mathematical sense, however, it is a conjecture stoutly to be confirmed. That's the way they used to talk and still do talk. We showed the photograph of an atomic event in a bubble chamber. Then we showed the photograph of another atomic event from this book that showed the first time that someone was able to posit a positron. It's kind of like a little poetic assonance here. To posit the positron. Incidentally, the first creative use of the positron was Sir Isaac Asimov, and he created his robots with positronic brains. And later on, even Data in Star Trek The New Generation has a positronic brain, an Isaac Asimov robot. And the very first rule of governing positronic robots is that they cannot harm human beings. Which does not mean that they cannot cause trouble. In a universe that admits of robots causing trouble, we will have to pass on everything that we have to descendants who will have to deal with those real situations. There will be men and women who will have real children whose nursemaids will be robots that will not harm them. But without our coming to this kind of education, that future will be a long ways away instead of being in the next couple of generations. About 1,000 years away. Medieval eras, sociologically, are like ice ages. They last and last and last, and nothing very much happens. Now, the West already had one ice age that lasted 1,000 years, where sociologically not much advance was made, and we are rapidly entering another sociological ice age. It's not something that needs to happen, but we need to make a change. Part of the change is here in this education, and part of the trigger in this education that makes the change is the understanding today, now, Nature 6, that similarity as an idea is more workable than identity as an idea in terms of proof, in terms of truth, in terms of operability. There are 4 traditional wisdom understandings that come out of the idea of similarity. Now, usually in the past have not brought ideas into play in the education until we get into symbols towards the end of the year. But because it's very important that this be delivered in the right way, I'll obtrude the idea of similarity here into this context. The first corollary that comes from the idea of similarity is that correspondence happens in nature. Correspondence. And that correspondence is a correspondence in resonance. One of the earliest symbols of this, a symbol that's at least 50,000 years old, is the Australian Aborigine symbol that is a spot, a dot, with target-like circles around it. That symbol of the resonant spot, the resonant place, the pebble thrown into the pool and the ripples coming out exactly from that pebble thrown in. That is a correspondence of resonance, image, symbol. It means that, logically, that analogy and polarity are always paired together. The second corollary of the idea of similarity is that of sympathy. Now you can see already, if you're alert to this, that the early anthropological characterization of primitive human societies was that they all were based on a magical view of nature that had sympathy and correspondence as operative procedures, and that somehow scientific thought of the modern age had shown that this was primitive. I urge you to recalibrate and not to call these primitive, but to call them primordial, and that primitive man was not primitive, but was primordial, and that these corollaries to this idea are operative in high-energy physics, in astrophysics, in cosmology, in mathematics, in disciplines that are more rigorous logically than most logical systems could bear. And that the kind of logic that usually passes as logic is a temporary placebo of egotistical projections based upon medieval ideas of unnaturalness. Now, you don't want to be caught in unnatural acts, do you? Especially knowingly. Recalibrate. Let it go. Sympathy is a sympathy of source, of base. Something is sympathetic. We used to use the metaphor in an earlier time. Certain plants send out shoots underground. They're called rhizomes. And then from time to time, new plants would come off the same rhizome. These new plants all had a sympathy with the original plant. So sympathy works in this way. Sympatheia. A sim, which means like symbol or symphony, sympathy. It means together. And pathe, it means a feeling tone that's together. One has sympathy because one shares a feeling resonance at the source, at the base. So that sympathy and correspondence are actually siblings of the same parent, similarity, and they have a third sibling. The third sibling is harmonic, harmony. That there is correspondence, there is sympathy, and there is harmony. And that harmony has to do with the fruits, whereas sympathy has to do with the roots. Sympathy is with a base that's similar, and harmony is that the purpose is similar. One comes into a harmony on the basis of a sympathy. So sympathy and harmony and correspondence operating in between, And the structure throughout this entire sandwich of similarity is pairedness, pairs. So that pairs and pairedness is always an operative structure, not only a structure of the situation, a structure of the thing, a structure of the event, but in addition to being structural, it's operative as in process. So that one has a flow of tension along a structure, so that pairedness is not only the way things are built, but it's the way things are built and the sap runs. It's the way in which the electrical current runs. So that the principle, the idea of similarity, has pairedness as a structural process flowing through sympathy, correspondence, and harmony. That is a very powerful idea. And it indeed forms the wisdom basis of all human groups on this planet. Whether it's China or India or Egypt or Greece or Iran, Mesoamerica, it doesn't matter where. This is the basic operative natural understanding. Similarity is capable not only of integration, but of reintegration. Similarity is capable of reintegrating. It's capable of integration. In the first order, it's capable of reintegration any number of times. So that similarity integrates and reintegrates, and one would ask the question, what integrates? Whatever is extant, whatever exists, whatever is operative. What does it integrate to? It integrates back into something which is real. Not back into something else which is real, but that the entire field of process that integrates, the entire range of existence that integrates, becomes real again. So that there is a quality of absorption which characterizes nature. And as a pair to the process of absorption, there's another process of, it's called emission. In the 60s, when graduate students were first talking in this way, they always had the Freudian type pun, well, are these nocturnal emissions? I hate to mention it, except that it's a sociological fact. And it had all these Freudian overtones in the 60s. No, they're not just nocturnal emissions. So absorption and emission are qualities of energy. What absorbs and what emits? Matter, stuff, things, atoms, molecules. It means that an atom, that a molecule, is capable of absorbing all of the resonances of itself back into itself and becoming exactly what it is. And when it becomes exactly uniquely what it is, it winks out of existence and joins the real. This is extraordinary mystery. In super science, when you take an atomic structure and you cool it to absolute zero, just a few billionths of a degree above absolute zero, every atom in this material will suddenly transform and act as one atom. It doesn't matter how big, how extensive it is, every atom will suddenly transform and will act as if it were just one atom. This is returning back to the real. This is Te being absorbed to the Tao, and it doesn't hurt the material at all, because as soon as you warm it up to a couple of billionths of a degree above zero, it returns back to its disparate atomic structure, and the atoms are differently but similar. Now, one can play with philosophic terms and say that at absolute zero, all atomic structure becomes identical, but it isn't that they're identical, they're unique. They become one. So nature has an operative base which includes 1 and 0 as realistically there. Not only does oneness exist, but zeroness is real. This is extremely powerful. One can remember this in times of any order of crisis, and can use this as a compass and a plumb bob to find one's center again. Indeed, the whole process of prayer in the West, of meditation in the East, and of mystical excess in where East meets West, in ancient Iran, in all three states, where one focuses to an absolute center, which is what meditation does, where one makes a harmony which extends completely through the entire being, which is what prayer is, or where one has an excess where nothing occurs in the place of presence anymore, like the whirling dervish. Whirls and whirls until there's nothing there where the whirling takes place at all. One can vanish the center by taking everything out from it. One can bring everything to the center, in which case it also vanishes. And one can spread this vanishing throughout the entire structure, in which case the entire structure vanishes. All these processes in a wisdom education are not only experiential and observable, but they are provable by demonstration mathematically. It means that nature has definite principles which are operative under any conditions whatsoever, and that in any situation they can be brought into play, and if brought into play with determination, with firmness, with staying power, they will eventually recalibrate whatever is happening and bring, no matter what is happening, back into a natural ordination, which enjoys then a cardinal sequencing, which we would call, I think the Southern American phrase is downright livable. Any crisis can be made downright livable by the application of these principles of nature. Now let's look at this from a slightly different angle. One of the whips that the unruly ego uses to lash us into doing what it wants to do is to tyrannize us by the idea of identity translated into a true and false logical procedure. Whereas a true and false logical procedure has limitations very, very quickly that one can point out, and indeed we will many times, but that the deepest logic is triune, not only true and false, but neutral as well. The triune logic of true, neutral, and false integrates itself to vanishing. This is true even on the level of atomic particles. Many atomic particles not only occur as a plus or a minus particle, but as a zero particle. In fact, the first particle to ever be found in 1947, the year the sound barrier was broken. 1947, the kaon. The kaons were found to be positive and minus, and a little later they were found to be also zero. And surprisingly, the zero kaon was found to have a pair so that there was a short and a long zero kaon. So that even on level, the kaons are called mesons. Even on the level of the first mesons, the first transcendental particles, they had nothing to do with photons, had nothing to do with electrons, had nothing to do with protons and neutrons, had everything to do with qualities of transcendence, or if you like the word evanescence. Mesons, like the kaon, were no longer in the universe of stability, but could only be observed in atomic accelerators that smashed particles together, two protons together, so that bits of them flew off. And the bits were not jagged edge fragments of protons, but other particles. Which means exactly what in 1932 was observed by Carl Anderson with the positron, the positive electron particle. That reality does not fragment. It doesn't produce shards. It's not like a plate of glass that when you break it, there's broken glass. But that the universe on every level has wholeness. There is wholeness on every level. And part of the difficulty which people had, not only in 1932 with the positron, in the 1940s with kaons, and even today with the wonderful spectrum of reality that's reopening again, the difficulty that people have is that these realms are fearful to the medieval habituated ego. And that sociological structures like communism and fascism, which are based upon large-scale ego projections, those kinds of government, those kinds of personality are very fearful of a universe which has wholeness on many levels which they cannot control. And that the universe should be whole on every level in which it plays, and that the level at which the ego and the totalitarian government subsist on does not even exist. It has no real order. It has no existential place. This comes as a shock. So that tyrants, whether as an individual or tyrants as in a totalitarian regime, protect themselves from the real, protect themselves from nature, protect themselves from the education which opens up all these levels where nature is whole. When a proton strikes another proton, very often what's released are not little fragments, jagged-edged arcs of a proton, but other particles like a kaon or a pion. let's come back. Let's come at this from another angle for a moment. We're talking about logic, how a true and false logic is severely crippled, that a true, neutral, false, triune logic has within it the capacity to be operative and mobile in realms of nature that really exist, as well as in the background of existence, which is a zero-based Tao. A triune logic is much more operable because it includes a neutral. Now, there are logics that can be developed that are multidimensional, not just true, neutral, and false, but we have to learn ABCs first. And when we go to other star systems in the coming generations after the 22nd century, there will be multidimensional logics that would just stagger the mind of today. There are infinite logics that dwarf the wings of imagined beings, and we are capable of flying and dancing with those beings by nature. Similarity reintegrates to the real, while identity circles the apparent endlessly. The popular phrase is going around in circles. What is difficult is that the imagination is capable of transposing the circle to other venues so that you think that things are changing because you're moving the circle from one thing to another. But a circle in your family on Wednesday transposed to a circle in your office on Thursday, if it's based on this identity of this circle, they're ineffective both places, both times. And other places, other times, all places, all times. The most ineffective is to apply that circle to oneself. Because most of what is operative in a human being is completely outside of the apparentness of the circles of the ego. Whatever circle your ego can draw and paste on you is an infinitesimal amount of your actuality. So we have to have a little tie string around the finger kind of statement now psychologically. Don't ask who you are. Be and know. It's an old phrase. It's an ancient phrase. It's tantamount to, instead of searching for an identity, recognize the possibilities. It's as simple as that. It's as radical as that. Recognizing possibilities opens up to life. Searching for the identity is actually leads towards the death. I think one of our great teachers in the past said you have a choice before you choose life. Let's try all of this. I have nothing more to say today other than that, but let's come back and try it from another stance. We began today by holding up a photograph of a pattern from a bubble chamber. We began with this image today. Curlicue coming from positive electron paired with the normal negative electron going off. The electron is the particle that's extremely stable in matter, and it's the relationship between the electron and the nucleus, that relationality, which condenses energy into a reciprocity between nucleus and the electrons around. And it's that reciprocity that gives existence of matter the solidness that it has. The solidity of matter is due to the reciprocity, to the strength of the reciprocity between the electrons and the nucleus. They give to each other so much that the atom seems solid, and many atoms making matter seems solid. What is very peculiar is that the electron, as we know it in the universe today, has two other states that used to exist in the universe, but that the universe has lost a little power, a little energy, and so those two heavier states of the electron no longer are stable in the universe, although they exist in atomic physics. They exist when one raises the energy of matter, like in a particle accelerator. And when matter is raised back to that energy, then these heavier states of the electron exist. There are two. So that with the electron and the two other states, there's a triad of states which exist for real in the universe as one complement, one half, if you like, of the complement of stuff, of the solidity of matter. The first heavier state of the electron is the muon. And the second heavier state, heavier even still, is the tau particle. The muon signified by a little m and the tau by a Greek T. It's interesting that the heaviest state of the electron, symbolized by the tau, is an ancient esoteric cross. And that usually when you have that ancient esoteric cross, it has one serpent that winds around it and curves at the top. And in ancient times, in the Hellenistic West, one used to see that. And occasionally in the modern West, one will find that, for instance, in the late 20th century Gnostic tradition, one finds that again. That symbol. It's also a symbol of Eden, of the serpent in the tree. The Tao being the basic symbolic tree, and the serpent being that energy that comes around. So it's a symbol in an esoteric way of an energy state that existed in Eden. And in the very early universe, when the whole universe was energized and shone with a brightness that exceeded light, tau particles and muons also formed matter, just like electrons form matter today. All this matter is formed by electrons, but there were two other orders of matter higher in the sense of more energy, much more energy. How much more energy? An electron has a megavolt charge of about 0.5, 0.511. Half a megavolt. That's the charge of an electron in today's universe. A muon has a charge of 105.6 megavolts. So a muon is more than 100 times as energized, as powerful. Which means that in higher energy states, which means the very early universe, there was matter 100 times more energetic than the matter that we have today. More than 100 times. In fact, because electrons are only half a megavolt, it's a couple hundred times. 213.2 times as energetic. That there was matter 213.2 times as energetic as this matter. And that was only midway. Because the tau particle is the higher, the third energy state, the thrice greatest energy state of the electron. What is its charge? 1.784 gigavolts. Not mega, but giga. Another zero and then more. And that matter also existed. That the tau particle was the electron that matched the nucleus of that third highest energy. Now, faced with this, the medieval regressive ego of totalitarian states of the earlier 20th century look like stupidity on vast scale. And to yearn for those outdated personalities and social types is idiocy beyond compare. But the yearning is a natural function of an educational system that does not raise the personality to sufficient insight energy level to see this. One of the most oft-quoted lines from the Gospel of St. John is, "Without vision the people perish," which is a direct quotation from the teacher of St. John. Vision is a differential mode of energy raising. It's the ascent of nature to higher orders of level of energizing. This education that begins with nature takes us through the whole ecology of what is presently here as nature. But the second year raises the energy levels back up again through all the levels that are also not only real, but extant. Existence, someone who exists in nature, exists in the ecology of this whole first year of the education. Someone who exists on visionary level, exists on higher energy plane, where everything is transformed and everything is changed. A heaven indeed. But there are heavens within heaven. This kind of educational maturity is a gift to man. All that is needed is to accept a gift. There isn't anything that anyone can do to earn it, other than simply to prepare oneself to accept it. In this quality of electrons and protons and neutrons, or on a higher level of muons and their components with the nucleus, or even higher with the tau particles and their components with their nucleus. There is a particle which runs the gamut, a whole family of particles, a whole six-fingered handful of particles that run the gamut that carry action. Particles that carry action. They have a weird name. They have a very strange name. They're called gauge bosons. And one of the family of gauge bosons is the photon. The photon is not an electron. It's not a proton. It doesn't belong to any of those families. It's not a quark. It's not a meson. It belongs to this very strange six-fingered family called gauge bosons, and what they do is they grab action and carry it. And wherever they are, the action is carried with them. Now the photon, the action that it carries with it is electromagnetic force. And when we see a photon with our eyes, and our eyes are made to see right at the middle of where the photon electromagnetic energy is. Our eyes are made by billions of years of refinement and evolution. Our eyes are made exactly to see the middle, the apex of where electromagnetic energy becomes visible light, and photons which carry electromagnetic energy right at the middle of that electromagnetic spectrum occur to us as white light. So that white light carries with it a direct angle of vision to the center, to the actuality of the real. Now, when put into this kind of framework, you can see that a metaphysics is an approximation, but that it misses the context and the structure and the actuality which an education really needs in order to be mobile and deliver by its transmission all of the good things of being and knowing. And just as a photon will carry the electromagnetic action force, a photon in and of itself has no mass. It has zero mass. If it had any kind of mass whatsoever, it would not be able to be a carrier of action. So that in a very peculiar way, the carriers of universal action, the photons outside of the atom, the gluons, which are gauge bosons inside of the atom, so that the gluons and the photons have this zero mass. Inside of the nucleus, the gluon, outside of the atom, the photon, with zero mass are able to do their work. But in the nucleus itself, in its relationship to the electrons, one has to have a tremendous energy to the carrier, so that the carrier particles, the gauge bosons that carry that energy in the atomic structure, outside the nucleus, but within the atom itself, that W and Z particle, the W positive, the W negative, and the Z, they have tremendous energy. In fact, their energy was not able to be raised by man until 1983. Man and all of his technological power was not able to generate enough energy on this planet until 1983 to be able to see these particles. And when the W particle was seen at CERN, the cyclotron on the Swiss-French border, in 1983. It was in response to a theoretical understanding that they had to exist. And at 83 gigavolts, not megavolts, the W particle came into being. And at 93 gigavolts, the Z particle came into being. So that the carriers of action are also particles, but those particles, called by that strange name, gauge bosons, also act as waves. Next week we'll look at, the lecture will be called Particle Te. It's the other side of the middle. There are 12 lectures. The 6th is one side of the middle. The 7th lecture is the other side of the middle. Notice that Lecture 6 and Lecture 7 no way are identical, but that they are similar. Thank you.